January the 22nd, 2018. Today, I'm going to introduce you to something that will happen without fail, that nobody talks about, but it is a certainty at some point in the foreseeable future. It's called a debt jubilee, and it will be part of the greatest depression the world has ever seen. We've hit a serious tipping point in America. The country, as I'm sure you've noticed, has become a financial, cultural and demographic pressure cooker. You've seen it in the riots and protests in Charlottesville, Ferguson, Milwaukee and Baltimore. Vice President Mike Pence walks out of an NFL game. You've seen it in mass shootings, the attacks on college campuses, the arguments about immigration, the refusal of NFL players to stand for the national anthem. These uprisings and protests may be nominally about race or Donald Trump or police brutality, but underneath it all, they are really about money and hopelessness. You hear the mainstream press and politicians constantly talking about wealth inequality when referencing the country's social problems and political polarization. But what they don't tell you is that the growing disparity between rich and poor in America is a symptom of the problem, not the root cause. The richest 10% of America owns 75% of the nation's wealth, a level not seen since the 1930s. The problem isn't that a small number of Americans have done well. The real problem is how they've done well. How the tremendous gains in wealth for the few have come directly at the expense of most working-class people. This is what's driving the anger, the radical politics and the growing racism in society. I mentioned this in my end-of-year review when I gave a long treatise on what's happening on college campuses. You might want to listen to that if you wish to refresh your memories as to what young people are thinking today. It's quite sobering. You see, while the rich are getting richer, everyone else is losing ground. I've mentioned several times on these shows how for most Americans real wages have been stagnant or falling for decades. The middle class, the most politically and economically stable part of our society, is disappearing. The foundation of the middle class in America was a long history of consistently rising wages. For millions of Americans, life got a little better year after year as the value of their wages increased and the economy grew into the world's largest. But this is no longer happening. Low-income earners now make less in real terms than they did in 1980, and middle-income earners make just 6% more than they made back in 1980. That's an increase of just 0.00172% a year. Imagine your boss telling you for 34 straight years that you're never getting more than a 0.00172% raise each year. No wonder people are so angry and stressed. They've been going to work year after year, but instead of earning more over time, they've actually been earning less in terms of what their wages can buy. Despite the boom in the US economy and financial assets over the past 30 years, which has boosted the wealth and incomes of the wealthiest Americans like never before, average Americans are actually worse off than they were decades ago. So they've been forced to borrow more and more money simply to keep up. You can see that in the data which is available to everyone. But I bet you don't even need to see the data. Just think about your friends and the people you know and how much more debt these people have to take on just to keep their heads above water. It used to be that most Americans didn't hold any debt apart from a mortgage on their first home. But after almost 40 years of declining real wages, Americans now have to go into serious amounts of debt for just about everything they buy. They now have more than $1.5 trillion in college debt, for example, and it's not just college loans that have soared. Americans also have more than $1 trillion in credit card debt and more than $1 trillion in auto loan debt, all record highs. It's so bad that 73% of Americans now die with debt, with an average total of more than $80,000. Being in debt is an incredibly stressful way to live. You're in a hole and there's simply no way out. So it's no surprise that death by drugs and poisoning for the bottom 60% of America's population have doubled since the year 2000, and suicide rates have doubled as well over the same period. This is incredibly sad, and it's unfathomable that this is happening in such a formerly great country. Unfortunately, the problem is going to get much, much worse. You see, tens of millions of people in America are desperate. They have no way out, and sooner or later this hopelessness and desperation are going to lead to violent and radical politics. This enormous political powder keg is leading to the biggest social event the country has ever seen, by far. The underlying economic problem in America today is that money no longer flows to everyone equally in the way that it used to. The income disparity widens every year. But most Americans don't understand why this is happening. The real underlying cause of wealth and income disparity in America is that wages are no longer connected to gains in productivity. You see, back in the early part of the 20th century, economic gains were shared by both owners and workers. Ford and his employees got rich boosting productivity. He got rich making the automobile affordable with the assembly line, a huge increase in productivity. These gains in productivity flowed directly to Ford's employees. Ford made headlines across the nation when he more than doubled his minimum pay overnight in 1914. But that doesn't happen anymore. Real wages have declined for most Americans despite huge gains in productivity over the last several decades. It's not that computers are destroying jobs or that jobs have been moved overseas. Back in Henry Ford's days, and for decades thereafter, productivity, a measure of how efficient we are at producing goods and services, together with income gains, moved hand in hand. But then something changed. As the Economic Policy Institute states, quote, "From 1973 to 2016, net productivity rose 73.7%, while the hourly pay essentially stagnated, increasing only 12.5% over 43 years. This means that although Americans are working more productively than ever, the fruits of their labours have primarily accrued to those at the top and to corporate profits, especially in recent years." End of quote. The divergence begins around 1971, the year President Nixon removed the US dollar from gold. This is important because paper money printed out of thin air doesn't transmit gains in productivity like real sound money should. When money is sound and reliable, it doesn't lose value over time. In fact, Quite the opposite. It buys more and more because of increases in productivity and efficiency. But the link between productivity and wages was permanently changed in the early 1970s when Nixon broke the link between the dollar and gold. As a result, today the American monetary system isn't sound or reliable. The politicians monkey around with the money supply constantly. They increase the amount of money by huge amounts in response to demands from powerful groups, especially banks. As a result, the things you need to live a regular life, such as gasoline, milk, housing and medical care, constantly get more expensive. These prices go up year after year, even when wages don't. In other words, even though there's been an enormous amount of wealth created by the economy in the form of huge new houses, condos, skyscrapers and electronic cars, life for average Americans hasn't improved one bit. The average worker has become poorer. Again, remember that that's not because the economy hasn't got better. The economy has boomed through enormous increases in productivity. Technologies like personal computers, cell phones, the internet, RFID tags for inventory control, gene sequencing, GPS, and fantastic increases to fuel efficiency. You can see these gains in your everyday life. But on the other hand, everything you need to live and prosper, from food to housing, healthcare to cars and education, has become way, way more expensive. The price of a new Ford F-150 pickup truck, for example, is up 1,137% since the 1960s. It's the best-selling vehicle in America and has been for decades. In 1969, a new truck was $2,500. But today, a new F-150 costs about $30,000 for the base model. For an F-150 you'd actually want to drive, the cost is about $45,000. That's almost an entire year of after-tax wages for the average worker. This all means that some people in America are doing very well. Look at the huge increase in the number of American billionaires. Look at how many more planes Boeing is selling. At the cars Ford and GM are selling all over the world. At the way the entertainment industry dominates movies around the world, and at the way the US tech firms such as Apple, Google and Facebook rule the internet. That's been great for investors and for tech-savvy engineers. But these terrific gains haven't impacted most wage earners because the gains in productivity and technology didn't flow through the entire economy the way they should or the way they used to. These gains in productivity, especially the improvements in technology, should have made the US currency much, much more strong. They should have made everything you buy, from Ford trucks to milk, much cheaper. But that's not what happened. As you know, instead, the cost of just about everything has gone way up, always. That's because no matter how big the gains in productivity are, the government, in the form of politicians and their minions at the Federal Reserve, have always created more money. Sometimes they do it by creating a lot of new credit, and sometimes by simply printing trillions of new dollars out of thin air. All this new money always causes prices to rise more than productivity. This is the big secret the corporate executives and politicians hope you never understand. Since wages are no longer connected to gains in productivity, over time there's nothing the average American can do to stay ahead of inflation. So most Americans have been forced to borrow in a way that is unprecedented in history. US consumers now have nearly $13 trillion in total debt, the highest total ever, even more than was owed right before the crash in 2007, in order to pay for food, housing, cars, education, healthcare, and other basic expenses. They owe $1 trillion on their credit cards, which often have interest rates as high as 28%. They've borrowed $1 trillion to buy new cars which plummet in value the minute you drive off the lot, and they've racked up about $1.5 trillion for college education with dubious worth. The debt load for the working poor has nearly quadrupled in the past 20 years as a percentage of their income, and this debt can never, ever be repaid. It's this system that dooms every average worker to poverty and almost guarantees that the rich and powerful will stay that way. Simply working harder or working smarter isn't benefiting employees anymore. On the other hand, Americans who own assets and businesses have seen their wealth soar over the last 40 years. So that's how we've been left with the biggest income and wealth disparity in America in nearly 100 years. For those who've taken on these incredible new debt loads, it's a very stressful way to live. So many Americans today are in a hole. They're extremely stressed out, and there's no way out. This is where the problem lies. This group is growing, and the stress and anger are building, ultimately fueling many of today's biggest issues. The next big crisis is already underway. Protests, like the one in Charlottesville, were just the beginning. Wait until you see what's coming next in America. It's why you see people rioting in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's why you see massive increases in violence and desperation in cities like Baltimore and Chicago. It's why you see more and more radicalized politics like resurgent neo-Nazi groups and the rise of Black Lives Matter. It's why you see historic statues being torn down, and why, according to a recent Harvard study, more than 50% of young people no longer believe in capitalism. It's why we now have the highest ever percentage of people on food stamps, double the historical rate. It's why in some states nearly 10% of working-age adults receive disability payments. Remember, I'll say it again, these uprisings and protests may be nominally about race or Donald Trump, police brutality or immigration, but what they're really all about is money, debt, and economics. That's why we will soon see a dramatic political and economic event, the likes of which we haven't seen in nearly 50 years. On Friday, I will be giving you the ultimate revelation of how all this is going to be resolved, and it is very, very frightening. I've thought long and hard about this for many years, and I am now in a position to let you know what I think is going to be the horrendous conclusion to all this. Whether you believe it or not, do not think for one moment that this is all going to arrange itself calmly and peacefully as the government wants you to believe. Indeed, they don't even address the problem, let alone suggest any solutions. All I'll say for now is that when the stock market unravels, as it shortly will, by listening to my shows, you will have been amply prepared to understand why this is happening. I can guarantee the mainstream media will not divulge any of this. Their job will be to try to prop up the markets for their lords and masters, and that does not include you.